there's also, again, this awareness that it was fading away rather slowly. And that what was meaningful about that, the reason I would come back to it, is that it afforded me this a rather unique opportunity to simply revel in and visit with this experience for a very extended period of time. I mean, it was just the entire rest of the day was spent in a state of absolute awe and the deepest possible peace. In fact, it was a fascination. It was unexpressible beauty. It is every possible word to turn the idea that death could be horrible, awful, or painful so utterly and completely upside down.
Today, I'd like to welcome Jonathan Van Valin to the show. Jonathan, welcome. How is today treating you?
Today is beautiful. It is a beautiful day in paradise in small town France at the moment, which is not my usual place, but it's lovely here.
I imagine it's quite quaint and beautiful out there. Jonathan, I have seen you speak about your story, and I'm just so honored to have you here today to talk about your story and to talk about other things in relation to your story. So how about we just get started with the near-death experience that you had?
Okay, we'll do it. So this was an experience that took place it's actually quite a while ago for me at this point. I was 29 years old, reasonable grown-up. The experience itself arose out of the recovery from a surgery. And no need to go into the details there, but it's a surgery that's rarely done anymore. It's one that's known for having an exceptionally painful recovery, which is a meaningful part of the story, which is why I mention it. And it had to do with removing a great deal of tissue from the back of my throat, the soft palate, and actually they removed a few chips of bone from the skull behind my nose and things like that. And the reason that it was done because of a sort of genetic quirk that gave me a severe case of sleep apnea. So I had gone through adulthood in a state of sort of mild to severe sleep deprivation without really understanding that at all. I just thought life was hard and required a lot of adrenaline. And but that was sorted out. The surgery is done, and I'm in recovery. I've been in the hospital for 4 days. I'm released on the 4th day into the care of my father, who just made it plain, made it clear to me that he just wanted to watch over me in that recovery, which is an act of love I will always remember him for. And was in his care, even though there really wasn't much of anything that he could do. I could do virtually nothing other than sit and stare out a window, and that was about it. So he hauled me out to the family house that's 2 hours away out in the country, and I kind of sit and stare out windows for a few days. And this is a really truly mind-bending blackout level pain experience. The reason for it, as it was explained to me, was that this is a lot of tissue that it's very, very nerve rich tissue. All the nerves in your body come up through this, part of your body, and they're all inflamed and excited, as a result of the surgery. And the analogy given me was that I was going to understand what it was like to break my leg and then have to walk on it for days. And that was absolutely accurate. It's among the reasons that this is a surgery that's rarely done unless necessary or something like that. So that's the state of affairs. I can barely speak in any way at all at the time, maybe just a whispered word at most. Again, this has really impacted the throat and all this area. And that's it. So I'm sitting around for days, and what initiates this experience is a simple, crystal clear inner click. I cannot describe it in any more clearer terms than that. There was just this awareness, this instant of, and in that instant, it was immediately clear that the life force here was immediately beginning to drain away, and the body was beginning to die. But in that moment, in that precise moment of that click, there was also some essentially sort of revelations that sort of flooded in at that same moment. In concurrence with that click, the first was that I was not my body, which was quite startling. Was that is a thought that had never occurred to me in quite the same way as it did in that moment. And the reason it could occur in that moment was that there was an instant shift in awareness such that I very clearly had the experience of observing the body and understanding what was going on with it, and that the body was in fact dying. But the entity, the non-corporeal beingness that was observing that, to my shock and surprise and revelation, was clearly not dying. There was nothing, it was not impugned or affected in any way. And that was so startling. It was startling not just because of the revelation of that itself, but because of the fact that what it meant was that in that same moment, the pain in that body was recognized as not necessarily mine either. And so it's in that moment that first accrues this experience that the suffering of that pain is not mine. It need not be mine. The pain did not cease. The pain was as full and rich and, pounding as it was the moment before. The pain didn't disappear. It's just that I could step away from the suffering of it, or it was shown that I was in fact a step away from the suffering of it. In fact, that had always been the case. I had just never understood it that way. And so it was a complete release from the suffering of the situation. Was the pain gone? No, but the suffering was. It was the first time I was shown that pain and suffering are two different things. So that's quite a start in that moment. The second thing that flooded in, and this all sort of happened simultaneously. There's not really an order to it. It was just sort of instantaneous, shift in awareness. But the second thing was the awareness that life force was draining away, and it was draining away relatively slowly, and that there was actually clearly some time, like probably a couple of days or something like that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the third aspect of that kind of blew away even the first of those awarenesses. And it was that not only was there this sort of non-corporeal, non-bodily sense of awareness or being that was not my body, but even that non-corporeal sense of being was something that was itself beginning to merge into what I could only describe as this infinite vastness, that it was beginning to lose its individuality, in fact, that it was beginning to dissipate, to dissolve, and fade into this overarching allness. And that was that begins to be extraordinarily difficult to put into words, but we're going to do it anyway today. As far as being a near-death experience and that sort of thing, and how those things are often told, and what was meaningful about that aspect of the experience was that it meant that if one's individuated sense of self has already been shown to be non-bodily, then you've cast off some extraordinary limitations. It's essentially the experience of stepping away from or beyond those physical bodily limitations. And that did and does confer a stunning amount of essentially freedom from the baggage of those dimensions, such as the pain in them.
Yeah, I'm curious because this is one of the parts of your story that fascinates me in so many of the works that I've done. Course in Miracles, Eckhart Tolle, all these teachings teach that we are not our body. And so I'm curious because I have a very strong intellectual understanding that we are not our body. Uh, but I do identify with my body quite often, and it's kind of a constant thing I have to come back to. Did you have this awareness that we are not our body prior to this experience, or did all of that just dawn on you when you had the visceral experience of it?
I could identify. So again, this near-death experience I was 29 years old, and I could identify two occasions, a couple of times prior to that, when I encountered something similar. And the first was so long ago, and I was a little kid, and I was probably 7 years old or 8 or something like that. I was terrible at sleeping even then, even though sleep apnea wasn't a thing yet. And so I was often awake, and I would lie in bed at night, and there was just because I was bored and the lights were off and I'm awake and I'm a little kid and I'm not allowed to get up and, things like that. So I'm sort of finding ways to entertain myself in the confines of my own skull.
Right.
And I discovered somehow internally in those moments that there was a funny way in which I could take what I began to think of as this backward step, and inside the confines of my mind. And it was like taking a backward step from what I would now call the personality, or that sense of self that's attached to the personality and things like that. And I found it odd and curious. And so as a little kid, I'd lie in bed at night and sort of play with it. And I'd sort of go in and out, and I'd be like, what about this? What if I take that step back? What about all these other things? Like, it seems like they don't really matter, and I would just sort of play around in that way. And, what's curious to me is, at the time as a little kid, but a little kid mind, I never conceived of that as something that was mystical or spiritual, or had any particular impact. It was just sort of a curious little curiosity that I would play around with, and that was it. I also kind of went on to kind of forget about it.
Yeah.
And I also went on to have, there are some ways, and in many ways I led a very ordinary existence growing up in the suburbs and going to public school, but there are some other ways in which life also was quite chaotic, and no need to labor over the details at the moment, but much of my teenage years were something of a pretty big disaster. And there was a time then when, at the absolute height of that particular chapter in the disasterhood, I ended up with what was definitely essentially sort of a rock bottom turning point as a teenager. I'm 17 years old at the time, and there was a lot of music in my background, a lot of that sort of thing. And I was actually standing on a stage alone in an empty auditorium practicing, and I stopped for a moment. And this was a time where, again, there's a lot of stories that could be told, but this is a period of time where I'm more or less in a suicidally black depression as a teenager. And if you knew the rest of the story, that would seem terribly reasonable, I think. But in this moment, I just feel something crack inside me in this quiet moment alone on a stage. And it feels as though that sense of personal identity just begins to fall away. But in that instance, I don't meet it in the way that I did as a little kid. And I didn't meet it in the way that I would quite a ways in the future. It was something that I found absolutely terrifying. It felt as though that separation there in that moment was like a glimpse into unhinged madness, like the tiniest shred of sanity that I'd been clinging to as a more or less troubled teenager was itself falling away. And that's why it felt like the last possible rung of the ladder to be clinging to. And as it fell away, it was a moment of really abject terror. And I could say it was a form of a unitive experience, but it was the worst possible face of it. And in that moment, the reason it was a turning point, again, had nothing to do with what you might call spirituality. It had only to do with that absolute terror. And the thought was, I need to run in the opposite direction of this as fast as possible. If I don't, I'll probably die. It sounds a little overdramatic these days. But I'm going to try a bunch of things. And if I succeed, fine. And if I don't, dying is actually a fine option, because this is otherwise too much pain and trouble anyway. But I will turn away from this and run as fast and as hard from it as I can. And it was a turning point in that way. And what that actually meant at the time, as far as my own journey goes, was basically an embrace of trying to figure out what it would take to live in this world, like the literal practical matters of like, how do you live as a human here? And I felt like I didn't understand that. And so that became the goal. And so what I did, instead of turning towards spirituality or something like that, is I turned heartily and heavily towards just regular life. And I can see in retrospect that that was a powerfully important thing to do at the time. And I did eventually, I was kicked out of school. I was arrested. It was a disaster.
Well, I get it. I've had a very
Yeah.
colorful past as well. So I'm tracking
Yeah.
with you.
So I eventually go to college. And I'm going to college. The reason I choose to go to school is because I thought I need to learn about the world so that I can learn how to be in it. And so to me, going to college was, again, it sounds a little overdramatic, especially these days, but to me at the time, it was a very literally life and death choice. Like, if I don't do this, I'm not going to make it. And so I followed my own course of study with great fervor, which did not always match the course of study that anyone else wanted me to be on, including family members and my teachers at times. But it was a powerfully positive experience. And if we jump ahead, more than 10 years later, I have a near-death experience, and I see a face of that self falling away in a different light, in a different context, in an utterly and completely different experience. I don't know that I would have experienced that near-death situation in the same way if there hadn't been, of course, all of these other things. So your question is apt. What happened before? Well, a lot of things, a lot of life.
Yeah.
A lot of preparation in a way.
Yeah. What's so interesting to me is how we tend to label spirituality, or we label experiences as spiritual, when the truth is, and what's so evident in your experience, is that we are a spirit, we aren't a body. So when you were a kid and you were playing with these concepts just because you couldn't sleep, and then later on when you were a teenager, you were having these experiences without the label of a spiritual experience, because
very much so. Yeah.
Everything is pretty much a spiritual experience, right? We're
spirits. Yes. Well said. Yeah, I'm actually deeply unfond of the word spiritual. I think it's a silly word. It doesn't really have much meaning, really. We could replace the term spiritual experience with human experience every single time and be just as accurate, or probably more so. And it's a much bigger basket, with a lot less baggage most of the time. It's sure, it's a spiritual journey. It is simply a human journey. Those are the same.
That's amazing. And what I also wanted to zone in on, and I know you're not done with sharing your experience, but this separation of the awareness of pain, the awareness of the pain that you were feeling, or maybe you weren't feeling it.
No, the awareness was there, like the pain's still here.
Yes.
Pain itself, not pleasant, but it was like I had an option all of a sudden not to attach to it. Like there was a way in which I could simply see that attachment to it was there was more of a choice in it than I had ever realized before. certainly in this context and in this way, that's how it was experienced. And that's not to say that, to oversimplify it. I mean, there have certainly been times and places in life in which there, there's no thoughtful separation of it. It's just like hammer to finger, ouch, it's but there was a way in which it was seen, and this is something we could come back to a lot, but it was a movement of mind that attached to it in a way that I had not seen so directly before. It also, because of that, it showed itself as more of a choice than I could have imagined before, in the way that we can, any human on the planet can relate to a moment when they changed their mind about something, or had a change in perspective about something, maybe because they got some new information or something. And no one would think twice about that. It was just like, oh, well, yeah, of course. Changed my mind because the thing. And it was literally shown to be that, essentially that simple. It's just that to see it with that clarity is what was unusual. So again, the pain itself wasn't gone. It was right there. It's just that I didn't have to tell a story about it. I didn't have to sort of be attached to it. That's not the perfect word, but it's about as close as I can come. I could simply let it be. And it was, the focus was simply not on the pain. It was the awareness more than anything that what was observing the pain was itself not filled with pain. It simply wasn't. It was completely apart from it. So if my identification or my awareness was primarily with that, then the pain could be as painful as it wanted. It didn't really make any difference at all. And so it could be little or gigantic or mind-bending or whatever. It just didn't really matter. And a point that I actually rarely make in these kinds of conversations was that was not limited to that physical bodily pain. The fact is that in that awareness, it was clear that absolutely any aspect of this four-dimensional time space had no impact on that non-corporeal being. That non-corporeal awareness being was outside the limitations of that four-dimensional time space in a way that it simply had no way to reach across and impact. And so there was actually nothing of any kind that could take place here that needed to be disturbing, which is kind of a bold, well, it could wreck a few synapses along the way. It could, it's here's what it meant at the time. It meant a release from the suffering of the situation. And keep in mind that that's also in the context of me being fully aware that the body is dying. But here's one of the funny effects of that then, is that the fact that that body was dying could not possibly be viewed as a problem or an issue or a big deal or like it was an issue in any way. It was just like the pain. It was just like everything else in this four-dimensional time space. It didn't have any meaningful impact on that aware being.
Yeah.
It just didn't.
Yeah.
And so there's also, again, this awareness that it was fading away rather slowly. And that what was meaningful about that, the reason I would come back to it, is that it afforded me this rather unique opportunity to simply revel in and visit with this experience for a very extended period of time. I mean, it was just the entire rest of the day was spent in a state of absolute awe and the deepest possible peace. In fact, it was a fascination. It was unexpressible beauty. It is every possible word to turn the idea that death could be horrible, awful, or painful so utterly and completely upside down that when my father came back around as he would sort of periodically check on me throughout the day. How am I doing? Again, there's not much he could really do. But he comes in the room at some point and he's like, how's he doing? And I say absolutely nothing. I can't imagine how to express any of this to him. I can't imagine how to explain, hey, Dad, I'm dying. That doesn't even seem relevant. That doesn't even occur as a meaningful thing to say. I just sit there in a state of completely, utterly blissed out peace, full in the knowledge of what's happening to me, aware that he doesn't fully grasp it, and that too is also just fine.
I'm curious.
And there's
so at this point, were you out of your body, your consciousness? Were you out of your body, or were you actually still in it? Like when he came to check on you, you were still in your body. Okay, got it.
It's an interesting question. I've often been asked it, and the question, well, were you having an out of body experience, is how it's often been put. And I would be very subtle about describing it a little differently. Because when someone says, oh, I had an out of body experience, then they're sort of contrasting these two things. There's this in body thing, that's a thing. And then there's this out of body thing where maybe the body's over there. And I'd actually had that experience. Oh, well, not at this point. There was going to be some of those coming up years up ahead a bit. But the thing about that frame of reference is that it sort of confers the same amount of reality. There's like my body as a thing, and then there's this not body as a thing, and those are coexisting in this universe that seems a little stranger than I thought, but here we are. And this experience was not that. It was because what it was showing me was not that I was out of a body. It was showing me that the body itself was itself a fiction. And if it's a fiction to begin with, then there was nothing to be out of. It was an illusion. It's an illusory experience of a body. And so, like when someone says, well, you're having out of body experience, inside to me, it resonates in a way that's very different than that. It was, no. What I was seeing was that what I had thought was so solid and real simply wasn't. It was just more of a figment and a fiction that had never been particularly real. And so there was no sense of leaving it, nor was there any sense of it being outside of a thing. It was, again, shown that it wasn't really a real thing in the first place. And so there was nothing there to have left.
Okay, now I have another curiosity because I study the Course in Miracles very deeply. And the Course in Miracles talks about how the body is an illusion. And it's basically the illusion of separation. So you and I right now, we are one. We're all one source of energy. And our bodies create this illusion that we are separated. So while you were in this state, when your dad came to check on you, did you feel more connected to him or other people you encountered during this experience?
I would, in a way. I would simply say that I just felt overwhelmingly loving towards him. And you know, you heard a little bit about some of my past there. I mean, my relationship with my father was by no means a perfect thing. There, you know, at this point in our own lives, we had come to a really beautiful detente, let's say, you know, a really sincere peace with each other, but it had not always been so easy. But I felt loving towards him. I knew immediately that there was no way, even if I could speak, there was no way I could find words that would convey what I knew to be true and what I was experiencing to him in a way that he would find meaningful or even possible to grasp. That didn't change in any way whatsoever the overwhelming sense of just peace and lovingness I felt towards him. And one of the things that's true about peace is that it's so full. Like the deepest peace is so full that it's not missing anything. And so there can be this sense in which there's no need for anything to be done. And that's exactly how it felt in that moment. It was just essentially an extension or a sharing of that peace, that lovingness. And that was all. And there was no need to even bring in the idea that my body was dying. That was an absurdity that need not even be trifled with. And so I said nothing at all. And he kind of went, huh. And he kind of, came in and came out, and that's how the day passed. And that was it. He eventually, throughout all of these days, the sleeping had been somewhere between impossible and a nightmare. And, pain and all this stuff. And in the state of that peace, there was a thought that was like, oh, well, I could probably go to sleep now. That would probably work. That sounds delightful. I think I will. And so I just go to bed. And throughout the night, I wake up, and every time I wake up, I check in. Am I still dying? Yep. Yeah, I am. In fact, it's happening a little faster now. That mercury is dropping. That life force is draining away a little faster. And it returns me to something that you were just inquiring about, which is that sense of separation. And I alluded to this initially, in which I said this third thing that cropped up was this merging into this vastness, and that sense that even this individuated, if still non-corporeal sense of being, the one that was out, that was beyond the limitations of that body, there was a way in which there was an individuated sense to that. Like, this is the me. It's just not the me that is associated with that very fictional body. But again, that third sort of layer of revelation was that me, that non-corporeal, individuated sense, was itself dissolving into what was absolutely overwhelmingly all. And it was in that way that you could say the sense of its separation from everything was collapsing and dissipating and simply dissolving away. That is exactly how it felt. And what I would wish to convey to anyone about that, because it's something that comes up a lot when people say, when they wonder, how did you see any loved ones? That sounds terrifying. I wouldn't want to lose myself, my sense of self. That sounds terrifying. And I can only speak really from the roots of that experience, which was that if something contains absolutely all, then it is missing nothing. It cannot possibly be missing anything. And so in that sense, it is because of that, there could not possibly have been any sense of fear, because there was no sense of loss. There couldn't possibly be a sense of loss. How could there be a sense of loss in something that is overwhelmingly, all-encompassingly whole? There can't. And so if there is no sense of loss, there cannot be any sense of lack or want or need, which is also why it's possible to look at a dying body and say, that need not change either. It's perfectly fine. It's irrelevant, in fact. Yeah. It means nothing. It's an illusion. It's also why, if there cannot be any sense of lack, want, or need, how could there be fear? There could not be. There wasn't. And so there was no sense of loss in any way. In fact, it's almost impossible to convey, but it is overwhelmingly the opposite of any possible kind of loss.
That is so fascinating, because so I'm going to try to put into words what I'm seeing and feeling right now as I'm listening to this, because what I'm hearing is that you had this individual sense of self, this individuated part of you that was merging into everything. However, you were still that individual as part of the all. Like, you still had your consciousness.
It was not, let me flip it around for you just a little for a moment. Let's see how it goes here.
Okay.
It was not that there was an individuated self feeling the allness.
Okay.
It was that the overwhelming allness reveals itself to be the real truth. and can conceive of the perspective of that individual.
Okay.
It,
So like
it
a
is
flip.
instead of the small thing looking up at the big, it is
Yeah.
the overarchingly big,
Looking.
beautifully, lovingly embracing that sense of its smallness.
Yeah. That is so beautiful and so fascinating. Like it just feels as if what I'm hearing is that we are part of the all, and the all is always supporting us all the time, no matter what.
Beautifully put. Yeah.
And
You are
that,
not just part of the all, you are the all. Yeah.
and what I also, I'm going to jump back a little bit, but what I also got from your perspective of the life force leaving you, whether it was slower or quicker, was that as you were having this experience, there was just complete acceptance of everything because there was no judgment. There was
Well,
not
that's an
like,
interesting point. Yeah, there was,
I'm
that's true. There
dying,
was
so
none.
that's a problem. It was just,
Right.
well, that's what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was essentially irrelevant.
Yeah.
Certainly irrelevant to that piece, certainly irrelevant to that awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, those are pretty big ideas. And when I woke up the next morning, again, I checked in and thought, am I dying? Yep. Quite a bit faster now. And as as the body died a little more and a little bit more, that merging into the infinite was a little more and a little more. As that dying sped up, that merging into the infinite sped up. And it was clear that there would be a point of, not coming, being able to reverse such things or something. Like there was a point of no return. If you merge all the way, then, well, there you go.
Right.
And so there did come this point the following day, and I really spent the following day for the most part just in the same way as I've described, but there was somehow some reflection in it where it was very, very clear to that mind of mine that I could continue on in this direction and merge into that infinite, and that to do so would be a staggeringly reasonable choice, because how could the greatest peace that passes all understanding seem like a bad idea? It's an interesting question.
Right.
And so I looked at that threshold with a very, very clear sense of choice. I could step over it, or I could actually have the option not to, if that was what I was inclined to choose. And that to make that choice involved no effort in any way whatsoever. This was not some sort of reward. This had nothing to do with merit. This had nothing to do with anything remotely like this. This was as easy as falling off a log. It was simply this way or that way, with no impediment whatsoever. And it was surprising to me in that state that there was a part of my mind that just arose and said, yeah, I think I'm not gonna. I don't even know why. I truly don't know why. Why wouldn't I go that way?
I have that question all the time when I listen to near-death experiencers.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
would you come back? But I'm glad you did it, so we could have this conversation, and so you could teach the world what you experienced.
I didn't have any grasp of it at that time. I really, literally, the clearest feeling I had was, I think I'm going to go back to the chaos and the madness. And there's things I think I need to do, or I want to do, and I couldn't even pick apart which of those it was. Did I want to, or did I need to, or was I don't know. I just felt compelled. I don't really have any greater explanation. It just seemed like the choice to be made, and so I simply did so. And it was relatively soon after, it was probably within an hour or two of that once again my father comes in the room, and he's like, I wonder how's he doing. And And for the first time in his entire, it's been days now, for the first time in his care, he looks at me and squinches up his face, and he looks at me funny, and he says, "I think something's not right, Jonathan. I think we better load up and head back over to the hospital." And I've actually made the choice at this point. I'm like, yeah, I think I'm gonna stay. And so when he says that, I'm like, well, all right, there we go, I guess. I mean, 49%, I'd be happy to go. It's like 51, 4. It's so close. So close. But I'm like, all right, I'll do it. And I'm not in a hurry, and I mess around, and I take my time, and I don't know. It takes forever to get my act together, and we go. It's a 2-hour drive. We go back to the same hospital that the surgery was conducted in the first place. I'm carted into the emergency room. I'm having a great time. I think that it's hilarious. I whisper out to the receptionist a request to order a pizza for the waiting room and at the ER. And just because I don't know, I just felt like cracking a silly joke, I guess. And the whole thing seems absurd and charming. And the docs finally, it's my turn. The docs see me. They quickly grasp what's going on. They confirm that I am dying, and I am dying for the dumbest reason ever. I'm dying from dehydration. And why I was initially kicked out of the hospital in recovery from the surgery under the circumstances and manner and all that, I can't say, I don't know. Yeah. But it simply means that the fix is very simple also. So they poke me with an IV bag full of saline solution, and instantly that life force feels like it begins to reverse. It is now flowing back in. I can feel the mercury rising. I can feel that merging with the infinite reversing. And because of that choice that was made, I feel content with that. I'm like, okay, I'm coming back. And it's really about as simple as that. Yeah. There's not much to it. This really is a simple solution. Of course, they keep me for a few hours to observe, and it's fine. And they send us on our way. We drive back. And I do a lot of reflection. I over that drive about, what it means to be here at all. Was I really glad to be coming back? The answer was still yes. My father's thrilled. He didn't really realize I was actually dying until we got to a hospital and someone said so. So he's thrilled, feeling good about things. And my recovery just quadruples, so over the next couple of days. It turns out being dehydrated is very difficult to heal up. Everything else struggles to heal when there's no water. Not a surprise. So the recovery becomes very, very quickly from that point. Pain levels drop. Everything's, 3 weeks later, I go back to my own home and I go back to work. And I cannot figure out how to square the experiences that I've been through and know what I know with going back to the regular warp and weave of everyday life. I find it very difficult to make any sense out of. And my response to that then, because people often have said, oh, the near-death experience, that must have been the most pivotal experience. It wasn't, not yet. And it's because I could not reconcile it with being late for work and in traffic and all the regular things. And so I essentially buried this experience in my own. I never spoke about it. And even when I told the story of the surgery, I never spoke about merging with the infinite and so on. What it did was very privately and very, very inwardly, it just kind of forced me in a different direction. There was something in me that it turned the spiritual questions and what you would have to call spiritual seeking up a radical notch that I wasn't anticipating. And that for me was a tremendously inward thing. I still you would never have seen me walking down the street and thought, oh, that guy's a spiritual seeker or a something spiritual. Never. You would never have thought this. Basically what it led to was a long series of other experiences over the course of the next decade that sort of forced me to reconcile with this experience. Some of those experiences had to do with death and dying. Some of them had to do with all kinds of other spiritual experiences. I often don't quite know which one to pick, because some of them were quite radical, and there's a lot of stories to tell. We could talk a long time.
What I'm most curious about in this period of your life, after the experience and after you had your recovery, were you able to, you had that separation of non-attachment. I won't call it separation. You had non-attachment to the pain and to the situation. Were you able to maintain that detachment, or did it, were you able to call on this experience to, I guess, maybe assist through some of these very earthly, very dense experiences?
Yeah. That was the first time I saw that difference between pain and suffering, and it was not the last. I really did bury this for years, like the next bunch of years. But you're actually touching on one of those very pivotal experiences. Maybe I can summarize here, but so the short answer first is no, I did not maintain it. But these additional experiences eventually came along that sort of forced me back in touch with it. And so, and I think it's in a way that you might find, well, I've been to 2 formal retreat situations in my whole life. So after, like I said, this sort of turned me on to a very quiet inner seeking, and I sent myself on a silent retreat for 10 days, which I'd never done anything like. And the first thing that happened, and I got to figure out how to summarize the story quickly, but my time at this retreat was one of those pivotal experiences that put me back in touch with that near-death experience in a way. Like what occurred there was so informative to the experience that I had at this retreat that they just seemed sort of intimately connected. And the first thing that happened was 10 hours a day of seated meditation turned out to, and I still couldn't believe, I can't believe it even now, but that caused a level of pain to arise in my body that I just could not believe. It was, and I was like, I know what real pain feels like. Right. How is this possibly happening sitting? And that's all. I'm fine. And it got to this blackout level pain again. It blew my mind. And it led to the series of experiences. First of all, that sort of fighting against that pain cracked open something in me. And there was this experience in which I felt the entire lifetime of my own collective pain all at once, like all the life, every bit of the pain, but happening in one moment.
And are you talking about emotional and physical pain, or?
Yes. The physical pain in the moment brought the physical, but it brought every piece of emotional pain that I'd ever experienced. It was sort of like having what people with the near-death experiences often call a life review. It was like the worst kind of life review. It was the review of every single instant of pain, emotional and otherwise. And it just cracked me wide open. And I'm in a silent meditation hall with a bunch of people, and I just start losing my mind, bawling. And that goes on, but that goes on. It takes a twist, and it gets so much worse in a way that I can't even describe without just saying the words, even though words just don't hold up to the experience at all. And experience all of my own collective pain turned into an experience of feeling the collective pain of mankind. It felt as though the collective pain of 8 billion souls just came coursing through my being. It was, again, what you could call a unitive experience in a way, because it felt as though every single one of those 8 billion souls was seen and experienced as one soul, except it was the worst face of it. And it was an overwhelm of such magnitude that I simply absolutely cannot put it into words. And if I'd been losing my mind in this otherwise silent meditation hall before, I was now, again, I just can't even describe, but my deepest apologies to all the other people there. And it just went on. Eventually some bell dings and it's like, well, it's time to get up. And I walk out of this meditation hall just shattered, just like shell shocked. And it initiates this inside me, first of all, the sort of a remembrance of some of those experiences from the past. And second of all, when I go back to sit down the next day, there's a part of me that just, oh God, what, I don't think I can handle any more of this. What are we doing today? What's going on today? What's on the agenda? Because I can't do more. There isn't more. And it was as though that day was like, it was sort of like the divine saying, here's the problem. Here's the issue. Individually, collectively, it's kind of all the same. Here you go. On that the next day, rather, I sit down, I feel that pain rise. I worry about it for a second, and then the experience turns, and it turns in a way that is remarkably similar to that NDE, in which there's a sense, first of all, of being back in touch with that very reality that body isn't actually me, that awareness that I carry around is something that is actually beyond or not necessarily contained by that body. And so that pain arose, in physically pain arose, and there was a part of me that was just like, oh wait, I remember now. And as I remembered that, then there came this point where there was again this sense of literal expansion of my sense of awareness. That sense of being simply felt as though it burgeoned beyond the literal physical space of this body to fill the meditation hall. And then it felt as though it simply expanded further until it expanded to the point that there was no way in which I could see the edges or perceive the edges of it. It was the odd experience of feeling as though my sense of self was located absolutely everywhere. And it was through that experience that it was again made so intimately clear that the pain in that body was simply, it didn't need to be attached to. But not only that, it also essentially shed light on the collective pain of not only myself, because it revealed all that collective pain to be, it revealed the collective pain of mankind to be of the same substance and therefore of the same transcendence. And the way it presented in my mind was, it was like, again, like, Jonathan, here's the problem. And the solution is this. It's not only this experience, but it's the understanding that absolutely every kind of suffering that we have ever conceived is the result of what at that time appeared to me, the word that appeared was, it is a misthought. It's essentially a mistake in thinking. Now, there could be a whole lot to unpack there. But from that point forward, I did not suffer the pain for the rest of the, whatever it was, 7 days of this retreat. That pain would arise in the body, and I was like, whatever, it's fine. I don't have to like it. I don't have to love it. Yeah, I mean, it's there. It's still there. I'm not saying it's pleasant even. I just don't have to be invested in it. And I'm not. And in that way, it's fine. I did not suffer for the rest of the retreat. I went into the following day, though. I mean, my mind is just blown. How does anyone come from sitting up from their cushion and be like, well, I saw the collective suffering of mankind and the solution to it. Excuse me? What? This is a silent retreat, which I was grateful for because I didn't want to say that to anyone. I couldn't imagine saying that to anyone. That sounded absurd and foolish to me. But I did go into the following day going, how do I connect the dots on this? Holy Mother of God. And that following day was spent entirely chewing on that question. And the response that arose inside at the time was one I think you're going to enjoy. It was 3 simple words, and the words were give up judgment, which, if I'm not mistaken, harkens back to something you just said earlier. And you were right, and right in a way that is of such magnitude and such beauty that I cannot express it, and it's going to make me tear up.
Yeah, I love this, like the misthought, the giving up judgment. I just want to go back and pull some pieces together here where what I'm hearing. So it's a choice is what I'm trying to come back to. Like, you had a choice to suffer. Suffering is a choice. You had a choice to suffer from the pain, or you had a choice to just be with it, is what I'm hearing. And you also had a choice to judge or not to judge. Am I hearing this correctly?
No, yeah, it's very accurate. It's just that I know that when we put that into such simplistic words out of the mouths of humans speaking English, that there could still be a great deal there that can be unpacked, that there's a great deal there that could be misconstrued, misunderstood. It is that simple, and yet as a functioning human, I've certainly experienced far too much pain to not be extremely empathetic to someone that's experiencing pain. And most of the time, to look in that person's eyes, even if you did it with all your heart, and say, you're just thinking wrong, is rarely ever helpful. In fact, it would be the opposite. And so, as true as the words you just spoke are, and I mean that full stop, there may be some subtleties that must come with it. And I guess, to me, in a way, that's a great deal about what the next leg of the journey was about, because I spent the next bunch of years trying to understand what we were just talking about.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting that. I know it can be a common trap or pitfall for us to, just say, oh, that's just a story, or that's just your choice, and the truth is, our experience is true. It's what we're experiencing right now. And it is true for us, even if it's not true for someone else, and vice versa. So we can always offer that compassion, because in that moment, that person is having an experience of something, and it's real in that moment for them. So thank you so much for, there can be a dark side to the simplicity of it's all in our minds, right?
Yes, there absolutely can. It's remarkable sometimes how we as limited humans have the capacity to take something that is staggeringly true and we just kind of layer some illusions on top of it, and what is fundamentally true is still somehow wrapped into that illusion in a way that it's remarkable how sometimes it can be unhelpful, yet still there is it comes around to me to that, and this is something that I contend with and chew on, I feel like, every single day, is that something I'm sure that you're very familiar with, actually, which is that people can only hear truth in a language that is meaningful to them. And that takes a truly vast array of forms. And most of them don't involve words, which I'm actually very grateful for. Some of my favorite are the ones that don't involve words, actually. But sometimes words are what we got. So we got to use the tools we have. So, you know, we do our best.
We use what we can, right?
We use what we can. Absolutely. Yeah. There's a place for them.
Yeah.
Even though words frequently suck, but sometimes that's what we got.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So there, you know, you touched on this experience, this to go through an experience like I described and to go back to the office was really strange. And, you know, the mundanities of whatever, taking care of the, you know, it doesn't even matter what it is, taking care of whatever the things are. I'm at the time I'm running a small company with a business partner, and he's a great guy, terrific business partner, outstanding human being. And I can barely contain myself. I do, but I can't seem to, you know, when faced with the entire collective suffering of mankind.
I could only imagine as you're merging with one and then you feel the entire collective, how even more mundane some of the things that we stress about can seem, for sure.
Really did. And I mean no disrespect in any way to any of this, or to anyone else's experience or anything, but I just increasingly from that point forward found it increasingly difficult to function in regular everyday life, because I kept finding that I found it difficult to care. I found it difficult, like all the usual motivating factors were just continually sort of eroding. Like, why is this even important? Why is that even important? I just cannot bring myself to get up the energy to deal with this thing or that thing, because it just, I just can't.
Well, you had so many expansive experiences that I imagine that would expanding so far and then having to focus would be just challenging in any situation.
Well, it sort of depended upon, I could not have said this at the time. I wouldn't have had the facility with it at all to grasp the understanding. What I can see in retrospect is it mattered where I was coming from. There were instances like if I went back to, you know, the moment when one of those moments where my dad has come in the room, you know, and I'm dying. He doesn't know that, but all I can think of is, you know, this overwhelming lovingness towards him. That's it. And that would make sense. That makes sense. But getting really wound up about some small detail of something in the business world, just I could care less about. So I kind of, there was a period where I just continually kept letting what looked like ordinary life drop away, fall apart. And that came to a point where I really did feel like life in the outer sense was falling apart, that I not only couldn't keep it together, but I didn't want to, and I didn't care. I couldn't explain that to anyone. This entire thing was tremendously inward. There was at no point in any of this journey was there, you know, was I part of a group or, you know, talking to teachers, or it was an extremely, I guess it just needed to be that way for me, but it was just an extremely inward thing that just had to develop in its own way. And my event, you know, over a period of years, then the other thing that kind of got woven into it was I would touch into these experiences of peace, and I knew that peace. I knew it from these other experiences. And it would just sort of descend. It seemed like it would sort of appear out of nowhere, and I would sit in the corner window in my home and, you know, looking out the window and just think, I really can't think of any reason to go to the office at all today. I just can't. And, you know, and that the pendulum would swing the other way, and I would be, I would really feel like a legitimate sense of panic. Like, what on earth am I doing? This is insane. I have a mortgage. I have, you know, there are relationships and there are people in my life and there, you know, all the things, functioning grown up. And it would swing back and forth. And somewhere in there, there was another moment, and it really harkened back to some of those early experiences that I shared with you, of looking inwardly and discovering, to my sort of shock, even though that might seem surprising at this point, I would think, where is that sense of self? And I would look inside and I was like, but I can't find it. It's not here or there. I can't seem to pinpoint it. Where is it? Where is it? What, where, how is this thing that seems so strong, so powerful, so thick, so compelling, so sure in the world, and yet I cannot find it. I cannot find it when I look. And I remember one of the first times doing that at this stage, and it immediately put me in touch with being a 17-year-old terrified, alone on a concert hall stage practicing. And it was that I had run away from at the time. And at this stage of the game, then, it was so different. It was sort of like I built enough of a solid sense of self that I could begin the process of really beginning to dismantle it, essentially, in a way. But that there had to be this sort of base of solidness that I really didn't have as a young person. And it took a long time to have that. But it also took all these other experiences to inform it. And instead of looking inside, finding that I couldn't find that sense of self, that it seemed like it was not there at all. It was lacking. Didn't come as terrifying. It came as fascinating. And I was like, wait a minute, let me look again. Let me look a little closer. Wait, what now? And this is sort of that experience sort of wafted in and out over this period of years. It would kind of come and go. And I'm sure that it wouldn't have come if it weren't for all those past experiences. But it also made functioning in outer life seem just so absurd that I eventually stopped doing all of it. And I just felt like I had to. And so I did that crazy thing, and I sold all my stuff, and I sold my car, and I gave the keys to my home to someone, and I said goodbye to the lovely girlfriend who was so understanding of something that she had no real understanding of. And I disappeared. And I essentially set myself on a retreat. It was a very silent retreat. I sent myself to the western highlands of Guatemala, where not only do they not speak Spanish, which I don't speak either, they speak a Mayan dialect descended from the Mayan Indians that nobody else speaks. Spanish is the second language. It doesn't matter. I wasn't doing any talking. And there was a series of experiences and a series of things, but it was during this time that where this sort of sense of self had swung in and out. And when it would swing, the way in which it was like that sense of self clearly isn't really there, and that was associated with such a peace. And then it would swing the other way, and I'd be panicked and like crazy. What am I doing? This is insane. But I can't turn away from that peace. I just can't. There's something about that is so simply right. How could that possibly be wrong? And that piece harkened back to that NDE. It harkened back to these other previous experiences. And they're just, through the process of what I was doing there on this silent retreat, there just came a point in which everything just felt like it fell away, and the pendulum stopped, and that piece just simply settled in. And the awareness of that lack of an individuated sense of self being true and real, it just simply collapsed. and it collapsed in a way that has never wavered. And that is without question the most pivotal shift that I've ever gone through, far eclipsing an NDE, far eclipsing seeing what it was like to feel the collective suffering of humankind or its solution, because this was sort of embodied in all of that. It was as though seeing that lack of an individuated sense of self made it very natural to understand the misthought. And so that piece just settled in, and it settled in a way that has never disappeared from that point. Even though I have to say, I have to give a shout out and a caveat to the basics of humanity in my own humanity. It was sort of like 70% of any scrap of fear disappeared because it was seen as so clearly irrelevant. It was attached to that self. And if that self wasn't true, then none of the rest of that was either. Essentially, the baggage of that self was also simply not true. But there is a way in which it's sort of like we don't get to be here without some of our basic humanity sticking with us too. And so what I would say is that overwhelming piece, the piece that passes all understanding, the piece of that absolute oneness, has always been at hand ever since. And sometimes I'm so surprised that humanity still manages to be present yet still. And so are there times when I've cried and had a hard time? Yep. And even in the midst of those, it was still clear that piece was present, that fundamental truth of that lack of a self, even if it was a self that was having a fictitious hard time, that its underlying truth was still true. And so it's still a very human experience. The slings and arrows of life still fly. But it's also true that there's a way in which I've essentially met those in a way that was and is fundamentally different than it was prior to all of that. With the advent of that shift, I knew that I was never going to go back to my old life. And I haven't.
Yeah.
The first thing I did was absolutely nothing. And I mean that really literally. It was as though it just needed to land. It's like it needed to settle for quite a long time. I spent almost between a year and a half almost not talking at all. And that is a strange way to be an adult. But the phrase that I've loved for a long time is, it was simply that silence was the best vessel for holding it.
Yeah.
And so I did. And I went then through a very long period of readjustment. I'm not sure it's over yet.
Yeah.
But the shift I'm talking about was over a decade ago, and I have rarely ever spoken about it in public.
Wow.
Very rarely. It's taken a really long time to marinate.
I am so grateful that you're talking about it now. And it's one of the things that I've loved about your story. I know I spent a long time in the beginning of my journey, and I probably still get into this kind of thinking where I just want to reach that that point of knowing or enlightenment. And the truth is, like, no matter how, in this time space reality, no matter how much we can connect to that, we chose a human experience. And so, like you said, there's still that humanity. And I know a lot of us in the spiritual space, right? Even just labeling it spiritual can get so um, up in the, cosmos or in the ethereal spaces that your story really has a very grounding energy to it. And that even in those challenges, we can access that peace, but we did choose a human experience. So thank you so much for sharing all of this today. I'm just thrilled that I got to spend this time with you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about this experience?
Yeah, I think I would just wrap it up in a way with one sentiment, because it is so true that I rarely tell stories, and one of the reasons I rarely tell stories is that some of them sound outrageous, and in that way, they often sound to people as though they can't imagine those kinds of experiences, or that's way outside of anything that they could imagine or conceive, or it's just different. And yet the underlying content of absolutely everything I've gone through, and certainly of the stories that I've told, is something ultimately loving. And I'm going to tear up again. And it's on that basis, though, that if anyone has ever, and we all have, if anyone has ever had a loving experience, whether that felt as though it was something that came from them or came to them, then they're touching something of what we've been talking about this whole time. They are not so far apart in any way. And from my perspective, they are not at all. Anyone that looks at something loving and tries to find, well, where exactly, what exactly, or where exactly was the love that underlied that action or underlied that experience that I had? Where was that love? They cannot put their finger on it. They will not. It's impossible to do so. They can't find it. It will be outside the scope of any space. There's no place in space that they can touch where, oh, that's where the love was. Not over here, over there. And if it is outside of that limitation of space, then it is by definition outside of the limitation of time. It is in fact timeless. And so there is no one who has ever had a loving experience on this planet that has not touched deeply, absolutely everything that I've spoken of today with you in some fashion. It is just as much their natural inheritance as it is mine or anyone. And that's good news.
That's great news.
So, amen to that.
I have 3 questions that I ask all my guests. So the first question is, how do you define God?
Oh my. My first response is that's impossible. God is an awareness, not definable in words, because God is beyond all the limitations that words could possibly convey. So I guess I would have to define God as that which is beyond all the limitations of any kind, which is exactly what you are. Anyway.
The next question is, what would you say is the purpose of life on Earth?
The only thing I can say about the purpose of life in general is that it is the journey towards relinquishing what stands in the way of that awareness of the God we just mentioned. That is a journey that could take a truly infinite number of forms. But that seems to be what we're doing here. And in the end, we find out it really wasn't much of anything at all.
The final question is, if you could take one piece of wisdom that you have now and offer it to a younger version of yourself, what would that one piece of wisdom be?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, just one.
Oh
Or
boy.
10. No.
Okay. I would do all right, I'll tell you. I think I know. I got you. But I have to describe the delivery vehicle, which would be a really big hug. Like, I want to put my arm around that troubled young man.
Yeah.
And hug him up. And I'm going to cry again. And whisper into his ear, "You got this. Just listen carefully."
Thank you. How do people find you, get in touch with you?
Come find me on my website. Write me an email. I will write back. The website is assistthespirit.com. There's lots of ways to be in touch. Sometimes people opt to be in touch in person, sometimes email, and sometimes I travel around and see people in groups and in person and things like that. Come have a look. Reach out. I'll reach back.
Jonathan, this has been such an amazing conversation. I'm so grateful that not only have you taken the time to spend with me this morning, but also all the words that you use to try to explain and paint a picture of your experience. Thank you so much for being you and for sharing your heart and your mind with the world. Again, it's been such a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much in return. It is an honor. It's a pleasure. It is, from my point of view, actually an equal exchange, and it's one I'm deeply grateful for.
Thank you.
I would like to personally thank you for tuning in to this episode. If you haven't already, please be sure to like this episode, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications so that you never miss a beat. And if you really resonated with this content, please share it with all of your friends so that collectively we can expand our consciousness. Have a very blessed week.